In 1975, most of America had never heard of a scrawny kid from New Jersey named Bruce Springsteen. He had 2 albums out, neither had sold much of anything. Columbia Records was reportedly this close to dropping him. And in the middle of all that uncertainty, there was one guy, a college dropout from Detroit, working at a scrappy little rock magazine, who looked at this unknown singer and said, "Essentially, this is the most important artist in America, and I'm willing to stake my career on saying so loudly in print before anyone else agrees with me." That guy was Dave Marsh. And on August 14th, 2026, he died at his home in Norwalk, Connecticut. He was 76. If you're a Springsteen fan, there's a good chance you've read his words without ever really knowing his name. Because before there was a Bruce Springsteen legend, there was Dave Marsh typing furiously in the pages of Cream and Rolling Stone, insisting that everyone else pay attention. This is the story of a man who spent 50 years being called the toughest, most opinionated, most argumentative rock critic in America, and who, underneath all of that, turned out to be one of the most loyal friends the music industry has ever seen. Let's get into it. Dave Marsh was born in 1950 in Pontiac, Michigan, and grew up right in the heart of the Motor City's musical explosion. This was a kid raised on Motown, on R&B, on the raw, howling garage rock coming out of Detroit and its suburbs, the Stooges, the MC5, Iggy Pop. That sound and that attitude never left him. Decades later, Springsteen himself would describe Marsh as having a straight-out-of-Detroit attitude, and if you know anything about Detroit rock writing in that era, you know exactly what that means. Blunt working class, deeply serious about music as an art form, and completely allergic to pretension. In 1969, Marsh dropped out of Wayne State University in Detroit. Not to give up on writing, to chase it faster. He became one of the founding editors of a brand new magazine that was starting up right there in the city, Cream. If you don't know Cream, here's the short version. It became one of the most influential, most fearless rock publications in American history. The birthplace of what people now call gonzo rock criticism. And working alongside Marsh in those early days was a guy who'd go on to become arguably the most famous, most quoted rock critic who ever lived, Lester Bangs. The two of them were friends and mentors to each other in those wild early Cream years, cutting their teeth writing about the music coming out of a city that, at the time, was producing some of the most vital rock and roll on the planet. By the mid-1970s, Marsh had moved on to an even bigger stage, Rolling Stone, where he became an editor and staff critic. He also wrote for The Village Voice and Newsday over the years, and in 1979 he took on a task that had never really been done before at that scale. He shepherded the very first edition of the Rolling Stone Record Guide, a book that for an entire generation of music fans without the internet was basically the Bible for figuring out which albums were worth your money. But even with all of that under his belt, Marsh is remembered more than anything for one relationship that started almost by accident, his connection to a young singer from Freehold, New Jersey. Here's where the story gets really interesting, because Dave Marsh wasn't just a critic who reviewed Bruce Springsteen's records after they came out. He was there before almost anyone else, actively pushing the rest of the world to pay attention. Marsh wrote about Springsteen early on for Cream, at a point when Bruce was still very much an underground cult-level artist, someone critics loved but radio mostly ignored. In 1978, Marsh wrote Springsteen's first ever Rolling Stone cover story, a massive moment for an artist still trying to break through to a mainstream audience. And there's a piece of music industry legend attached to Marsh that's almost too good to be true. The story goes that Dave Marsh was the person who got Jon Landau to go see Bruce Springsteen live for the first time. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Jon Landau went on to become Springsteen's longtime manager and record producer. One of the most important professional relationships in Bruce's entire career, a partnership that's still going after 50 years. And depending on who's telling the story, that whole partnership may trace back to Dave Marsh pointing Landau in Bruce's direction. In 1979, Marsh published Born to Run, the Bruce Springsteen Story, one of the very first full-length biographies written about Springsteen, arriving at a point where Bruce was still on his way up, not yet the global icon he'd become. It became a New York Times bestseller, and for a huge number of fans, it was the first real in-depth account of who this guy was and where he came from. Marsh followed it up in 1986 with Glory Days, Bruce Springsteen in the 1980s, covering the massive, stadium-filling years that followed Born in the USA. But here's the thing that made Marsh different from a typical fan-turned-biographer. This wasn't just professional admiration. It became personal, deeply personal, in a way that tied his entire life to the E Street family for the next 5 decades. In 1979, Dave Marsh married Barbara Carr. Carr went on to become Bruce Springsteen's co-manager, working alongside John Landau for decades, managing one of the biggest careers in rock history. So Marsh wasn't just writing about Springsteen from the outside. He was, quite literally, family to the operation, married to one of the people steering the ship for the rest of his life. That closeness clearly meant something to Springsteen too. In his tribute after Marsh's death, posted to Instagram, Bruce wrote that the loss had left the E Street Band heartbroken. His words are worth hearing in full because they tell you everything about the kind of relationship these two men had over half a century. Springsteen called Marsh his great friend, praised that straight-out-of-Detroit attitude, and described him as soulful, intelligent, heartfelt, opinionated, bruising, and, in Bruce's own word, fantastically argumentative. He said Marsh deeply believed in what he was trying to accomplish, and that his lifetime of support meant the world to him. Think about that phrase for a second. Fantastically argumentative. That's not a backhanded compliment. That's Bruce Springsteen, one of the most respected songwriters alive, telling you that one of the things he valued most about Dave Marsh was that the man would push back on him, wouldn't just nod along. That's rare in any industry, and it's especially rare between an artist and someone as close to their inner circle as Marsh was. Now, Bruce Springsteen was hardly the only artist Dave Marsh wrote about, and honestly, if you only know him as the Springsteen guy, you're missing a huge amount of his legacy. Over more than 24 books, Marsh wrote about Elvis Presley, The Who, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Sly and the Family Stone, and Black Sabbath, among many others. His book on The Who, Before I Get Old, is still considered one of the definitive accounts of that band. He also wrote The Heart of Rock and Soul, the 1001 Greatest Singles Ever Made, a book that became something of a cult classic among music obsessives trying to argue with his rankings, which honestly is exactly the reaction Marsh probably wanted. And here's the part of Marsh's legacy that's a little bit funny in hindsight, and honestly kind of endearing. The man had opinions, and he was never shy about putting them in print, even when they aged. Let's say, controversially, he once dismissed Led Zeppelin's legendary drummer John Bonham as clinically incompetent. He described Freddie Mercury's voice, one of the most celebrated instruments in rock history, as merely passable. And he called the Grateful Dead, one of the most beloved live bands in American music, the worst band in creation. Now, if you're a Zeppelin fan, or a Queen fan, or a Deadhead, you're probably yelling at your screen right now. And that's kind of the point. Dave Marsh wasn't in the business of being universally agreeable. He was in the business of having a genuine, fully formed point of view, and defending it with everything he had, whether or not history eventually proved him right. In an era of music writing that's often flattened into algorithm-friendly star ratings and consensus reviews, there's something almost refreshing about a critic willing to plant a flag that unpopular and just leave it there. Marsh's work wasn't just about music criticism for its own sake. Either he treated it as serious cultural analysis with real intelligence and real stakes. That reputation earned him serious industry recognition too. In 1993, he shared a Grammy Award for Best Album Notes for Aretha Franklin's Queen of Soul box set, a genuine honor in the music world, recognizing not just his writing, but his deep understanding of the artists he covered. He also co-founded a newsletter called Rock and Rap Confidential, which kept his political and cultural commentary on music going strong for years. And then, in 2004, Marsh found a whole new audience. He joined Sirius XM, where he hosted a show called Kick Out the Jams for 19 years. He also helped create E Street Radio, the Springsteen dedicated channel, and hosted additional shows tied to it, including live from E Street Nation. For a whole generation of listeners who never picked up his books or his old Cream and Rolling Stone columns, this was where they knew Dave Marsh's voice, literally, on satellite radio, still arguing, still opinionated, still totally in love with rock and roll, decades after he started. Now we have to talk about the part of Dave Marsh's story that isn't about music at all, because it might be the most important thing he ever did. In 1993, Marsh's daughter, Kristen Ann Carr, died. She was only 21 years old. The cause was sarcoma, a rare and aggressive form of cancer that attacks bone and soft tissue, and one that's particularly devastating because it so often strikes young people. Losing a child is the kind of grief most people never fully recover from. Dave Marsh and Barbara Carr didn't let that grief sit still. In their daughter's memory, they founded the Kristen Ann Carr Fund, an organization built to support families going through cancer treatment and to fund research specifically into sarcoma, the disease that took Kristen from them. For over 3 decades now, that fund has continued doing exactly that work, turning one family's unimaginable loss into ongoing, tangible support for other families facing the same fight. It's a quieter part of Marsh's legacy than his books or his radio shows, but for the families that fund has helped, it's very possibly the most meaningful thing he ever built. Tragedy would touch this family again. Marsh's stepdaughter Sasha, a clinical psychologist, passed away in 2024 at the age of 55 from causes that weren't publicly disclosed. Through all of that, and through his own declining health in his final years, Dave Marsh kept working. According to his friend Jeffrey Sinclair, a co-editor of the online magazine Counterpunch, Marsh had been living with a degenerative brain disease for several years before his death. He died Friday, August 14, 2026, at his home in Norwalk, Connecticut. The news broke publicly through Jim Rotolo, the Sirius XM host who had worked alongside Marsh for years on E Street Radio. Rotolo posted the news on social media, calling it sad news for what he described as E Street Nation. And thanking Marsh directly, Dave wrote several books about Bruce as part of a remarkable body of work spanning some 25 titles. A longtime rock critic for Cream and Rolling Stone, he was also one of the creators of E Street Radio and hosted Kick Out the Jams on Sirius XM for 19 years. Rest easy, Dave. Thank you for everything, my friend. You will be missed. And then came Bruce's own tribute, the one that's been quoted everywhere since the news broke, because it says, in just a few sentences, exactly who Dave Marsh was to the people who knew him best. A friend first, a believer in the work, and someone whose support, across 50 years, genuinely meant the world. So why does the death of a 76-year-old music critic, someone most casual music fans have never heard of, actually matter beyond the sadness of losing someone? I think it's because Dave Marsh represents something that's genuinely become rare in music culture, the critic as believer. Not someone chasing clicks, not someone hedging every opinion to stay safe, not someone waiting to see what everyone else thinks before forming a take. Marsh looked at an unknown kid from New Jersey in the mid-1970s, when Springsteen's label was reportedly ready to give up on him, and said, "No, this one matters, and I'm going to spend my career proving it." And he was right. And more than that, he stayed right there, in Bruce's corner, for the next 50 years, married into the very team that helped build one of the greatest careers in American music. But Marsh also proves something else, that being a great critic doesn't require being universally liked, or even universally correct. The man called the Grateful Dead the worst band in creation. He's not walking away from music history looking infallible, he's walking away from it looking honest, which, in the end, might be the rarer and more valuable thing. And underneath all the arguing, all the record guides, all the strongly worded opinions about Led Zeppelin's drumming, there was a father who turned his daughter's death into decades of help for other grieving families. There was a husband who spent his entire adult life, in his own words through Bruce's tribute, being bruising and argumentative in the best possible way, in service of the music and the people he loved. So the next time you put on Born to Run, or you flip through a used copy of the Rolling Stone record guide at a thrift store, or you catch a rerun of an old E Street radio segment, remember there was a guy from Pontiac, Michigan, who helped build the language we still use to talk about why this music matters in the first place. Dave Marsh, 1950 to 2026. Rest easy, Dave. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments. Had you heard of Dave Marsh before today? Or did you know his writing without ever knowing his name? That happens more than people realize with the great music critics of the last 50 years. If you want more deep dives into the writers, musicians, and behind-the-scenes figures who shaped the music we grew up on, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. There's a lot more of this coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.